It was the second week of October, and the maples along my street had just started turning. I remember that clearly because I'd been standing at the kitchen window with my morning tea, watching the leaves drift down onto the front walk, thinking I should probably call someone to rake before the first snow came. That was the kind of thought I had those days. Quiet, ordinary, manageable. The kind of thought a woman my age is allowed to have when her life is finally settled. I was 63 years old. My husband had passed 4 years earlier, a heart attack. Quick and without warning. The way the doctors always say is merciful, but never quite feels that way to the people left behind. After he went, I'd spent about a year barely functioning, another year learning how to function alone, and then slowly, in the way grief eventually allows, I'd built something that felt like a life again. A small life, maybe. But mine. The house had been ours. My husband's and mine, for 26 years. A 2-story semi-detached in a quiet part of Mississauga, the kind of neighborhood where people still wave at each other, where kids ride bikes on the sidewalk in summer, and the smell of someone's backyard barbecue drifts over the fence on a Sunday afternoon. We'd bought it when our daughter was 3 years old. She'd grown up in that house, learned to ride her bike on that driveway, had her prom photos taken on the front steps. That house was not just a piece of real estate to me. It was the last place where my husband had been alive, where I could still feel him in the walls. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter, because that's all she'll ever be to me no matter what she does. Had moved out at 22, married at 25, and settled into a life in Oakville with her husband and their 2 children. I adored her. I visited often. I thought we had a good relationship. I thought I knew her. I clearly did not know her husband at all. He was the kind of man who smiled too quickly. That's the only way I can describe it. You'd say something perfectly ordinary, and he'd smile before he'd even finished processing what you said. Like the smile was a reflex, a defense, something to get in front of before you could look too closely at his face. My husband had never trusted him. He'd said so to me privately, more than once in that careful way he had, not accusatory, just observational. There's something about him, he'd say, and I'd tell him he was being overprotective, that our daughter was a grown woman who knew her own mind. I said that so many times I started to believe it myself. That October morning, the doorbell rang at 9:30. I wasn't expecting anyone. I set down my tea, pulled my cardigan tighter. The house was always a little cool in the mornings by then, and went to answer it. My son-in-law was standing on the front step. He wasn't smiling. That was the first thing I noticed, and it landed strangely because I couldn't remember a time I'd seen his face without that reflex smile on it. He was holding a large brown envelope, the kind with a metal clasp. The kind people use for documents. He looked past me briefly into the house before he looked at me directly. "Can I come in?" he said. I stepped aside. I don't know why. Habit, I suppose. "You open the door for family." He sat down at my kitchen table. The same table where I'd eaten breakfast that morning, where my husband and I had helped our daughter with her homework 20 years ago. And he put the envelope down between us, like it was something he'd earned the right to put there. "I want to talk to you about the house," he said. I sat across from him. "What about the house?" He opened the envelope. There were papers inside, multiple sheets, and he spread them on the table in a way that felt practiced, like he'd thought about the order of things. He explained that he and my daughter had been under what he called significant financial pressure for the past 18 months. His contracting business had lost 2 major clients. They had a line of credit that was extended past its limit, the children's private school tuition. His idea, always his idea, was due in January. He used the phrase cash flow crisis 3 times in the space of 2 minutes. I listened. I kept my hands flat on the table. I listened to every word. Then he pushed one of the papers toward me. It was a listing agreement. My address. My house. It was already signed by a real estate agent. The asking price was $840,000. There was a line at the bottom for an owner's signature. "We're going to list it next week," he said. "We figure after agent fees and the remaining mortgage balance, we clear somewhere around $420. We split that with you so you'd walk away with about $210. That's more than enough to get you into a nice condo in the area. Cooksville has some lovely buildings. Streetsville, too. You'd be closer to the grandchildren." I looked at him for a long moment. I looked at the paper, then I looked back at him. I said, "Is that right? We've done the numbers." He said, "It makes sense for everyone. The timing works for the spring market. But we want to list now, before the holidays slow things down." The agent says, "I'm sorry," I said. "Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. You've decided to sell my house. It's a family asset," he said carefully, "given the equity, given the current market." "My house," I said again, just those 2 words. He smiled then. Finally, that reflex smile came back. "We're not trying to make this difficult. We want what's best for everyone. This is a practical decision." I folded my hands together on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I felt something very cold and very clear move through me, and I recognized it after a moment as the feeling I'd had the morning the hospital called about my husband. The feeling of the world rearranging itself into a shape you didn't choose, and having to decide very quickly what kind of person you are in that moment. "I'll need some time to think about this," I said. He seemed to take that as agreement. He patted the papers back into a neat stack and said he'd leave copies with me. He said my daughter would call later. He said they really did want this to be smooth, for everyone's sake. After he left, I sat at that table for a very long time. There are things my son-in-law did not know about me. He didn't know me well enough to know them, and my daughter, whether she knew and didn't tell him, or whether she'd simply forgotten what her mother had been before she became just Mom, hadn't filled in the blanks. What he did not know was that before I married, before I had my daughter, before I became the woman standing at the kitchen window watching leaves fall, I had spent 11 years as a paralegal in a real estate law firm in downtown Toronto. I had spent 11 years reviewing title documents, purchase agreements, discharge statements, and transfer deeds. I had spent 11 years watching what happened to people who signed things they didn't understand, and watching what happened to people who tried to take things that weren't theirs to take. I picked up my phone and I called a very old friend. Her name was Patricia. "No, I'm sorry, I keep doing that. We'd worked together for 8 of those 11 years. And she'd since become a licensed real estate lawyer with her own practice in Brampton. I hadn't called her in 2 years. When she answered and heard my voice, she said, "Oh, this doesn't sound like a social call." "It's not," I said. I told her everything. She was quiet through most of it, the listening who is listening professionally, cataloging details. When I finished, she asked me 3 questions. Was the house solely in my name? Had I signed any power of attorney documents since my husband's death? And had my son-in-law presented that listing agreement as something already in progress or as something he needed my signature to proceed? The house was solely in my name. It had been transferred fully to my name 18 months after my husband's death as part of estate settlement. I had been meticulous about that process. Meticulous the way you are when you are a grieving woman who also used to be a paralegal. I had signed no power of attorney documents, not for my daughter, not for anyone. And the listing agreement he'd put in front of me, it had my name printed on the owner's line. But I had not signed it. He can't list that property, my friend said flatly. He has no legal standing. None. If he's already been in contact with an agent and represented himself as having authority to sell, that agent may be in violation of RICO regulations, and your son-in-law may be looking at fraud. I asked her what I should do. She said, "Nothing yet. Let me make some calls this afternoon." I went about my day. I made lunch. I raked some leaves. I called my friend back at 4 o'clock. What she had found in the space of those few hours was this. My son-in-law had met with the real estate agent, a woman in Mississauga, twice in the past 3 weeks. He had told her that he was acting on behalf of his elderly mother-in-law, who had asked the family to help her sell. He had provided the agent with what appeared to be a drafted listing agreement with my information filled in. He had not apparently told the agent that I hadn't actually agreed to any of this or that he had no legal authority to act on my behalf. The agent, when my friend made inquiries, was not pleased. That is putting it gently. My daughter called that evening, around 7. I could tell she was nervous before she'd finished saying hello. She talked around the subject for a few minutes. How were the grandchildren? How was I finding the cold weather? Had I noticed the leaves were turning early this year? And then she said her husband had mentioned stopping by, and she hoped it had gone all right. "We should talk," I said. "Can you come Thursday?" She came Thursday morning, without her husband, which is what I'd asked. She sat at the same kitchen's table, and I sat across from her. And I looked at my daughter. My daughter, who had her father's eyes and who I had loved every single day of her life without condition, and I said, "I need you to tell me what you knew and when you knew it." What followed was one of the hardest conversations of my life. Not because she was dishonest. She was, to her credit, achingly honest. She told me that her husband had brought the idea to her 6 months ago, framed as a plan to help everyone. It would solve their financial crisis, and I would be set up in a nice, easier place to live. She'd had doubts. She said that clearly. She'd asked questions, but she had let him take the lead, and she had not asked enough questions about what taking the lead meant he was actually doing. She had not known he'd already met with an agent. She had not known he'd put my name on documents without my consent. When I told her what my friend had explained about RICO, about fraud, about what her husband could be facing, my daughter went very quiet in the way that means a person is reorienting themselves to reality. It's a particular kind of silence. I recognized it. I'd felt it myself, sitting at this same table 3 days earlier. "Mum," she said finally, "I'm so sorry." "I know," I said. "What are we going to do?" Here is what we did. My friend sent a formal letter on her firm's letterhead to the real estate agent, advising her in clear legal language that she had been approached by an individual with no authority to act on behalf of the property owner, that no listing agreement was valid without the owner's signature, and that the agent was urged to clarify her understanding of her obligations under the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act before proceeding further. The agent withdrew from the situation immediately. I was told later that she also terminated her relationship with my son-in-law entirely. A separate letter was sent to my son-in-law directly again from my friend's firm, outlining the specific legal exposure he had created for himself and advising him in the strongest possible terms that any further attempt to act on behalf of my property or to approach any financial institution, real estate professional, or government body on my behalf would result in a formal complaint to the appropriate authorities. He did not respond to the letter in writing. He called my daughter instead. She told me later that the call lasted 40 minutes and that she had done most of the talking. I want to be clear about something. I did not hate my son-in-law. I don't say that to be generous. I say it because it's simply true. I had spent enough years around people who'd made terrible decisions under financial pressure to know that desperation doesn't always announce itself clearly. It creeps. It tells you the story you need to hear to justify the next step, and then the next one, until you are standing on someone's front step with a brown envelope full of documents you have no right to be carrying. That doesn't excuse it, but it helps me understand what I could not understand. What took me much longer to make peace with was my daughter's part in it, not the fraud, which she hadn't known about, but the agreement, the willingness to let someone persuade her that her mother's home, her childhood home, the house where her father had lived and died, was a problem to be managed rather than a place that belonged to me as absolutely as anything in the world. We had a lot of conversations that winter, more than we'd had in years, if I'm honest. Some of them were uncomfortable in the way that necessary things often are. I told her things about her father and about my marriage that I'd never told her because she'd been young, and I'd wanted to protect her. And I suppose I just kept protecting her out of habit long after she'd become an adult. She told me things about her marriage that she'd been keeping quiet, protecting me from in the same reflex way. It's strange, isn't it? How families can live alongside each other for years, protecting each other from the truth until something sharp and painful cuts through all that protection, and suddenly everyone is just standing there in the open air, looking at each other clearly. My son-in-law lost his contracting business in February. It had been struggling for longer than he'd admitted to anyone. And when the credit line finally closed, there wasn't enough to restructure. He and my daughter sold the Oakville house, their house, which they did own outright, and moved into a rental in Burlington. It was smaller. My grandchildren changed schools. That part was genuinely sad. Children don't choose the situations they're born into. He got a job in March, a management position with a construction firm in Hamilton. It was a step down from owning his own business, and I think he felt that deeply in the way a certain kind of man feels the loss of status as something close to physical pain. My daughter told me he'd been different since then, quieter, more present somehow, which is the strange thing that sometimes happens when a person's particular kind of pride gets dismantled. I don't know what their marriage will look like in 5 years. That's not mine to know. What I know is this: my house is still mine. The maples along my street go red and gold every October, and I still stand at the kitchen window with my tea and watch the leaves come down. My grandchildren come on Sundays. Sometimes I make the butter tarts they like, the ones with the runny centers that their mother always says aren't good for them. And I make them anyway because I am their grandmother, and that is one of the last remaining freedoms of my life. They run in the backyard, the same backyard where their mother ran when she was their age. And I watch them from the kitchen window. And I think about how much of our lives happen in the same small spaces, layered over each other like years. Last spring, My daughter came alone one afternoon. A Tuesday, unexpectedly, no particular occasion. She brought me flowers from the market, yellow tulips, the cheerful kind. She set them on the counter while I put the kettle on, and she stood in the middle of my kitchen and she looked around at everything. The photos on the fridge, the hook by the back door, where her father's old jacket still hangs, the windowsill where I keep my African violets. And she said quietly, almost to herself, "I forgot how much I love this house." "So did I said, "for a little while." She looked at me. I looked at her. There was a lot in that moment that didn't need to be said. I poured the tea, and we sat at the kitchen table, together, in the ordinary, quiet way of people who have found their way back to each other. And outside the kitchen window, the tulips in the front garden were just beginning to come up, small and determined, the way things that have survived winter always are.